The format for this meeting is an interview with an alcoholic, the hot seat, inside the alcoholic studio. A speaker will be asked a series of questions that range from their personal story, the steps, relationship with God, and carrying the message. There are no right answers, just a fun and interesting way to share the speaker's personal insight. Our speaker for tonight is...
Victor S., and I'm an alcoholic.
Oh, thank God. It's going to go so much better.
Okay.
Timekeeper, please allow 90 seconds per question. The meeting may run slightly longer. Members, please feel free to leave if needed. Speaker, please say done when you have finished your answers, or please say pass on questions you would prefer to skip. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's begin. Please generally describe, in your own words, our basic text, the book Alcoholics Anonymous.
So the book has its roots from the Oxford group, right? And we'll find reference to the Oxford group. If you have a third edition on page 262, and if you have a fourth, it's 292, and you'll find the original 6 steps. And in it are the 6 steps which have 17 words in them. And essentially, those 17 words is what Bill Wilson, in his second moment of clarity, you could say, in sobriety, is what launched the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And from those steps, essentially, here we are all these years later. And that book is a spiritual way of life. It's not a self-help way of life. This is all about self-abandonment, is what I've come to see in that book. So, yeah. And as you were reading here, it's like they told me an idiot was running my life when I was brought to you, good people. I might want to have someone else interpret that thing and share it with me, which has been very profitable, because I was using a sick mind to read a spiritual book, and it just wasn't working out for me. So, sponsor to interpret it is a very good idea. Done.
Are you an alcoholic? And if so, what personally makes you an alcoholic?
So, yes, I am an alcoholic. And the first time I ever was brought, because I didn't want to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. I've never wanted to come to AA. There was a fellow by the name of Chuck. He used to say that when I had a choice, I chose to drink and not to come to AA. And I came here at 18 years of age, and in my mind, I was too young to be alcoholic. You had to be 21 to be alcoholic. I was sure that was in the book, you know. And of course, that's not how it works here. I heard someone once say that if you think you're too young for Alcoholics Anonymous, you probably are. If you think you're too old for Alcoholics Anonymous, well, then you probably are. And what makes me alcoholic is a threefold illness. And I'm of the school that believes it's a disease, an actual disease. It's a physical allergy to the chemical alcohol. My body processes and breaks down alcohol differently than a non-alcoholic, which generally creates a craving. Then there's a mental obsession, which is a thought that overrides any other thought. And sometimes I'll get a thought in the middle of the thought, pretend not to have that thought. And generally it's all about pursuing some kind of fun, something outside of me to make my insides better. And then, of course, at the core of all that is a spiritual malady, right? This conscious separation between me and the maker that made me. And that, to me, is what alcoholism is. Done.
What does the concept of anonymity mean to you?
I think my definition is very different. Certainly, I've never been interviewed at the press, radio, although this is kind of that. But anonymity, in the long form of the 12th tradition, says that may our great blessings never spoil us. And what I was taught anonymity is to do something for somebody else and not seek credit for it. This is an act of anonymous. It's a spiritual anonymity. And certainly I wouldn't want to go out there and be a bad example of AA, so I wouldn't want to use my last name in public if that ever comes up. But also I'm here because my ego is out of whack, right? And I'm one of these guys that I have an ego complex with an inferiority complex at the same time going on. So it's good to stay right sized. In fact, I think it's better for me to stay small enough to stay in AA than try to become somebody in here. So the anonymity part is, and I'm one of those guys, I want credit. If I do something with my wife at home, I'm wondering how come she didn't see that the dishes are emptied. My spouse said that's what normal people do, but in my mind, I want the applause, you know. So that's how I see that.
Please give us a brief sketch of your drinking career up to the time you quit.
So I was an alcoholic of the pig variety and of the puking variety. There's projectile pukers. I'm not one of those guys. I'll just tell a little story, and hopefully this will paint the picture. I like to go to bars. It doesn't matter what they are. And I like well drinks, and I like beers. A pitcher back then, they were $4 a pitcher, right? Maximum drinking. And sometimes that, not to be graphic, but sometimes the stuff would start coming up. And I knew there would be the uh-ohs, the signals in the head that would kind of start going off. And I'd try to make it to the door. And usually if I could make it to the door and had my hand on it, I could feel it coming open. I knew it was going to be okay. Because I had learned to hold it long enough before that violent eruption would come out. But the worst is when the damn door would hit your foot and then you're vomiting into the door and then you do the face plant into it. That's kind of the way my drinking went, And the last thing I'll say is I wasn't too successful with the ladies out there, even though I was a legend in my own mind. I'd have some of those chunks up in there, those snacks after vomiting, and I'd have streaks coming down, and I thought, I'd make the eye contact with her thinking she was looking at me. She wasn't looking at me, And none of that stuff seemed to matter if the formula was ingested just right. What mattered was in my head was I was becoming the thing I needed to be to come up out of that horrible, self-defeatist low esteem. So it was always that balance. So done.
Alcoholism is described in the book as a fatal illness. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, I can come to meetings, and meetings are certainly absolutely necessary. I think a little closer to the truth that I found here is I've got to give this thing away in order to keep it. So I got to work with some drunks. I had a sponsor who he fell off a roof, and he ended up taking some pills. And because he's alcoholic, the next thing you knew, we found him with a fentanyl patch under his tongue. And this was a man that was a very revered member of AA. And so fatal to me is what he did next, which is he was still going to meetings through all this stuff. And one day, the madness in his head got as loud as he was when he was out there. And he had his family in the house, which included his 3 children, his grandson, his wife, and his mother-in-law. And he went and grabbed the family's 38 Special and just offed it right there in his backyard. So fatal can happen. And I've come to see that my alcoholism untreated sober may be just as bad, if not worse, than when I was out there, because of the ego and because of how I set stuff up now. Like stuff like this can be very dangerous for an alcoholic if I'm not sponsored. So another part about fatal is me sponsoring me is just me leaving. There's a guy named Bob D that talks about the guy coming in, but most importantly the guy or gal that's maybe in their last 30 days in here and they don't know it, that they're on their way out one judgment at a time. The fatal aspect of alcoholism. The book says the main problem centers where? Centers in our minds. So, done.
What are the conditions of your mind and body that accompany your alcoholism?
Okay, so I think I've talked a little bit about that. I think if I could focus on the mental part, to me, the mental part is much more interesting than the drinking part. Half the time I'd drink and it just was sloppy, nasty, dirty. I'd wear the same underwear 4 times because you could just put it inside and out, and it would magically fix itself or something. That's the physical side. I was a slob. But the mental part is by far, I think, the how do you treat an obsession? How do you sit in a meeting and that mind is going and you're thinking about things and then you miss the meeting and that's where you went for the treatment of alcoholism? How do you combat that? How do you redirect your mind after redirecting it? And it's I've got that self-centered fear going on. I'm worried about what's going to happen in a month. I'm worried constantly about what people are thinking about. So I think the mental side is to kind of go from being a taker to a giver. It's like what I was trying to do here, to get quiet enough to say, God, please come in here and please keep me out of this so we can do your work, right? So trying to get in there. Done.
In your understanding, what is the role of a sponsor? Do you have a sponsor? And how often are you in contact?
Yeah, great question. So I have had, yes, a firm believer in sponsorship, because like I said, if I don't have somebody there, then I'm running the show, and that didn't work too good for me. I'm just speaking for myself. And we also know in the early days that Bob referred to Bill as his sponsor. And he even said before he passed that him and Bill never had a bad word. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We have, of course, a chapter called Working with Others, which is essentially a manual on sponsorship, right? So my first sponsor was a guy named Bill H. He had one eye looked up, he had one eye looked down, and he was crazy, but he was very firm. And I think I wasn't shopping for a sponsor. I think I was one of those guys that when the student's ready, the teacher appears. and he went sideways at 4 years. And then that man I just shared with, he kind of became my sponsor. And I have a sponsor now. He just moved to Arkansas. He's a wonderful man. He was sponsored by Sandy B, which some of you may have known. And I've always been lucky to be around great men of AA and women. And there's a saying that too much is given, much is expected. And those men, they didn't tell me what to do. They showed me what to do. And they had me over to their house, and we got in that book, and it was just beautiful learning about Alcoholics Anonymous. And I hope in some small way I can give back what they gave to me. So yes, big believer in sponsorship. And I talk to him, even though he's in Arkansas, a couple times a week. And I like to try to keep the conversation on him, and he, of course, tries to ask me about me. And so that's all I have to say about that.
How have your sponsorship needs changed from early sobriety until now?
That's another great question. You guys did a good job. So early on, I don't think I was any different than any other alcoholic. I was, excuse the language here, but I was batshit crazy. I was just a thought in the middle of a thought, right? I was just crazy. I had no idea what was going on. You asked me how I was doing, I got no idea how I'm doing. That to my day is still my most, I hate that question, how you doing? I got no idea how I'm doing. You know, how I'm doing depends on the thought, right? You know, I could be up, I could be down. And so what was the question again, as a matter of fact? Sorry.
How have your sponsorship needs changed from early sobriety until now?
So not much, actually, apparently. So early on, there was a lot of the hand-holding. What is Alcoholics Anonymous? Sit in the front row. Be quiet. Don't worry about the people behind. Dress up. Dress the best you got. All those fun. The women have a chance in AA. I didn't date the first 6 years in here, not out of virtue, because they told me something that was very important, and that is that we live them alone. You know, and everybody gets a shot in Alcoholics Anonymous. So those needs where I needed to be shown Alcoholics Anonymous. What it was, and most importantly, what Alcoholics Anonymous is not. Because just because I'm in a room of AA, I've come to see that I may not be in a room of alcoholics. You know, not for me to judge. And then I think as we go along, I've got to become the giver, right? How do I sponsor people? That's its own. That took me years. You know, they got weird questions, you know, or I don't even know what the hell they're talking about half the time. And I realized they don't know what they're talking about. And that's exactly where I was, you know. And they used to say that. We don't even know if we're going to be okay. How do we know if you're going to be okay? Just get in the car. So then there was that phase, you know. And then there was the phase of I got to get familiar with that book. So, and now it's more of, like I said, just trying to get closer to God. So, done.
Have you completed the 12 steps? And if so, what is your suggested time frame for completing the steps of AA?
So this gets me in a lot of trouble. I am the old school, and I reference those 6 steps. There's a paragraph right before. Now, that story is from a man that essentially started Alcoholics Anonymous in Chicago. And in there, Dr. Bob was his sponsor because he talks about how Bob led him through all the steps. And he makes reference to time being 3 to 4 hours. And that's how I was led through them. I was led through them in a matter of days. When it came to the amends, they took me to make my first amends. And the explanation was that if this thing really is an illness, a disease, why would I sit in the ER with a severed leg waiting for somebody to come in there to help me? So it was an experience of urgency. And that's how I still work with the guys. And secondly, is I've only found it necessary to take those steps once. I know a lot of people take these steps over and over, and I would never disagree with anybody. That book says for me. First, I don't read that in the book anywhere that suggests I should. Secondly, I've been so lost in giving this thing away that every month or so, I'm through them steps again. And I'm always learning something in that book. I don't know if you guys have ever had that experience, but I go in there and I think, man, where'd that come from? I read that paragraph 1,000 times, but I never saw that. So, again, I'm not an authority on anything here. I'm just another drunk. But I think if there's anything we can agree, it's probably better to take these steps maybe a little sooner than later. And I like to leave it at that. So, thank you. Not that I have an opinion on it.
In your own words, please describe steps 1, 2, and 3.
Step 1 is the problem. Real simple. Step 2 is the solution. And step 3 is the decision to go with the problem or the solution. And that old boy Bill with the crazy eyes told me a story about 3 frogs on a log. And they said if one made a decision to jump off, how many would be left? And me and all my infinite newcomer wisdom said 2. And he laughed. He thought it was funny. He was always laughing. He used to say, I bet we both did the same thing. We thought about you all day. And then he'd laugh, you know. And he said, no. 3, a decision doesn't do anything unless it's followed up or merited by action. So, and some people will say, well, the first step of action is the fourth step. I wouldn't argue with that, but I think there's a decision here to essentially say, God, can you help me out here? Can you help me not be the actor that the big book talks about, right? Can you help me be sincere? Can you help me be of service? I think that's the decision to make. So, done.
What does your unmanageability and self-will look like?
I think you guys probably have seen already the mind working a little bit here, right? So, problem is if I don't get my way, I become what some people call king baby. I don't know if anybody else has that problem. I don't do well when things don't go my way. I just don't. I don't seem to, and I get angry. And then the problem is when things don't go my way, then anger gets in there. And sometimes some of us just hover around 6 or 7 on the anger meter. And then you throw in the crazy meter where some of us are always at about 11 on that 1 to 10 meter. And it's just, I don't know, it's every day's an adventure for me. And when I say adventure, I'm talking about I'm not trying to lose my shit out there in society. Whether it's Red Hawk, whether it's at the pharmacy, and it's the smallest petty thing. So, and manageability, and this is what I was saying earlier, I think it can be worse for me sober. I think because I got some time, I should know something. What should I be? Where should I be at, really? I'm just an alcoholic, right? What do I really know? This whole thing is about uncovering, discovering, and discarding, Chuck said, right? So, unmanageable. Let me not go to a meeting in 3 days. Let me not talk to my sponsor in 2 weeks. And it's like a guy once told me, don't ask me about my sponsorship, about my sobriety. Why don't you ask my wife? She'll tell you everything she needs to know about it. Right? Done.
What is your concept of a power greater than yourself, and how are you turning your will and your life over to it?
That's a hard question. The first thing they said was, there's a God and you're not it. And maybe for some of us, that's where I had to kind of start, right? And then they said, Victor, if there is a power, they didn't call it a rock, any of that crap. They said God. They said if there is a God, then there's certainly certain face forms of that power. And what would those face forms be? They talked about love, patience, things that I knew that they were right about. But knowing that intellectually did me no good out here in this world because I had to live them. And that was the thing, was I could think them, but they said what you think doesn't mean what you live. You are what you do, not what you think. And I used to have a couple stickers on the back of my truck and they made me take it off because they said, you cut someone off, that don't make you one of us. You'll embarrass us. Don't embarrass us. And I had to realize that my belief system is what I do. And it's constantly changing. And I don't know. I just know that the same God that pulled me out of that hell that I was in 23 and a half years ago can certainly get me through whatever it is I'm going through today. And I'll just say this on this and be quiet. Is Frank, my sponsor the other day, before he left for Arkansas, he just left. He said, please, if you're new here or if you're struggling, and make no mistake about it, if you're struggling, you're in the right place. Most of us have waves of anxiety and fear and depression happening than good stuff. Most of us are suffering in here. He says, please come all the way in. Come all the way in and sit all the way down. And that's Alcoholics Anonymous. So, done.
Please briefly describe your experience with steps 4 and 5.
So that was pretty simple. We knelt down after that 3 frog on the Lord, and I got kind of suspicious of kneeling down with this weirdo, and it was about the time when Pulp Fiction came out, and he had this other guy who was about 5 feet tall, and I was convinced he was like the Gimp, and I'm like, what the hell is this going on? And he said, and this isn't in the book, but he gave me my 4-step papers right out of the big book, right out of that book where it says the cause, all that stuff, and he said, I'm going to give you a week. He says, and you won't find the week. He took me to those 3 or 4 hours. He says, but generally what I found is that if an individual who comes to AA doesn't do this 4-step within a week, I usually don't see him anymore. And the other thing is he was sponsoring a lot of men. He says, and my job is I have to be as effective as possible to people who want this way of life. So my hope is that you'll finish it. And I did what I think most of us do. I waited till the 6th day and woke up, and he was serious. I mean, he was a very direct human being. He said, I don't care about your feelings. I care about treating alcoholism within you. And so I got it done. And here's what impressed me. is he looked at his calendar. This was before phones. He says, the next available time I have, we're gonna do your fifth step. And I think it was the 2 days later. He had a wife, he had kids, he had all that stuff. And we sat there, he put a pot of coffee on. I think we smoked 2 packs of smokes each. And so 2 days it was done, both of them. Done.
What does the exact nature of our wrongs mean to you?
See, I'm pretty good at seeing the exact nature of your wrongs, right? So now this is, I think, what people are saying when they redo steps, right? And for me, thank God for the 10th step. If I'm not mistaken, it says continue to take personal inventory. And I'm one of these guys that after I did the 5th step, there was a tremendous amount of relief. But the next day, I was right on me once again. The insanity of being sober was right back on me. And like you guys had page 86 and 87, and also the information before it, where we're to continually look for fear, dishonest motives. That's what has to be. That's Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So that's what I have to say about that. Done.
Please briefly describe, in your own words, steps 6 and 7.
So I hear kind of a couple schools of thought on these. I hear some people that say, "Oh, it's just a couple paragraphs in the book," and then they'll go to the 12 and 12 and they'll pontificate. And I don't even know. After a while, I don't think anybody knows what the hell they're talking about. And I'm not poo-pooing the 12 and 12, but I think that book is written exactly the way it's supposed to be. And I think the 6th step is the only reference to time in the steps in the book, and the first one's 64, but it's a whole textbook. It says after 1 hour of essentially reflection after that 5th, we basically take this 6th step. And then once that's done, it says we turn on to the 7th step, and the 7th step is a prayer. So that's what my sponsor did with me, is after the 5th step, I went to the back room that he had for an hour, smoked a couple more cigarettes. He asked me if I'd left anything out. I think I did. Wasn't a big one, but I went back and he said, okay. And then he read to me those precious sentences there. And we knelt down and did a 7th step prayer. And then he said, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what he said. And then it was on to make the 8th step. And not to get too far ahead of myself, but he said the 8th step was actually already done. And you'll see that in the book, right? And so I think they're simple steps. I think if I'm not careful, I'll overthink the steps. And if I'm not mistaken, in my view, maybe the most important thing is there in the 7th one. It says humbly asked. I've got to humbly ask for some help here. And that's a lifelong deal. Done.
What are some of your character defects, and are they being removed?
So I think, every character defect possible. I don't think I'm any unique or different than the next person in here. And as far as removing them, I tried to remove them many times at the bar stool. I think sometimes I did. I think they got worse too sometimes. But I don't know. I am not too good at removing stuff like that. I think that if I just get busy in here and through almost self-neglect, and I don't mean self-neglect and not bathing and that stuff, but me not worrying about me so much, that my whole outlook, everything just changes. And I think those things, they don't go away, but they dissipate. I think it's like a meter. They go up and down has been my experience. Anxiety, fear, afraid of God, afraid of what you think about me, afraid of being comfortable in my own skin, afraid of dying, the big ones, guys. That stuff will come and go, I think, depending on my spiritual condition. And even when, man, I tell you, it feels like I'm fit, I can still be egotistical because now I think I got something. So the whole thing is dangerous, you know. But I haven't. The more I seem to try to remove them, I think the stronger they get in a weird way. So, done.
Please briefly describe steps 8 and 9.
I had a feeling this was coming. So 8 again. 8 might be, in my view, the simplest step there is. And again, I've heard people talk on, and I just don't relate to it. I think right there it says we made it when we did our 4th step, right? And when it came down to me, my sponsor sat down and we transferred most of the names. You know, yeah, some people say, oh, I didn't have names. It was no big deal. I mean, there's no big shots in AA. Yeah, I had maybe a half dozen more. It took 10 freaking minutes, not 10 years to redo, I had the 8th. I knew I needed to make amends to. And it's like they told me there was 2 or 3 things that I was going to go to the grave with. Those were the ones I had to make amends to. Those are the ones I was afraid to admit, and those are the ones I was afraid to make amends. And that's generally what I've seen in my sobriety, is it comes down to that. So the list is easy. List, like my sponsor said, don't worry about the amends, just write the list. Okay. And then what they did is they said, now, some amends might take the rest of your life. But let's start with one that we could get going on the 9th step. And once you get going on the 9th, we're going to continue through the other steps. And that's when they took me to my parents in the Bay Area. He drove me all the way there. He talked about Alcoholics Anonymous, and I made amends to those folks, and then we drove back. And then he said, it's up to you now to make your financial amends and these other amends. I've had amends where the door closed on me because of the monster and the atrocities and just the disdain that human beings had for the way I lived out there. And that book says we may do more harm. It's not about me at that point. It's trying to rub out the record. So, done.
Victor, why is it important for you to straighten out your past?
So they said I had to be honest with myself, right? And it's hard to sit here with a fellow like Jesse and ask him to do something that I'm not doing. And if I haven't made amends to my children or tried to, how can I ask that human being? That's a lie, right? So I think, if nothing else, for the harm I did, to try to get even, to try to make it right. But if this is a life of trying to give this thing away, of standing by the door so another human being may be able to enter that world or that spirit, then I should probably try to be, an example of what this thing is. Done.
When you were actively drinking, did you drink whiskey in your milk?
Actually, literally drink whiskey in my milk?
It's a story from the book.
So I don't know if I actually drank whiskey in milk, but I've drank whiskey and tequila, and I'm not a very high-end guy. In fact, pretty much, I always seem to try to get more volume, and I'm a gulper. If you're looking for like characteristics of how I drank, yeah, I'm not very fancy. I come from my family are from the Azores. They're Portuguese, so homemade wine, as soon as the grape ferments, it's drinkable, and that's what I was around. So, yeah, and like I said, when I found out that you could get well shots, I was all over that. Back then it was $1. Why pay $3 when you can get 3 shots for $3? And then you become the hard-boiled egg guy in the bar. That's a big deal, right? So, but I certainly, and then I think probably what you're really asking is if that peculiar mental twist, where if somehow I could minimize the drinking part, that it might make me normal and other people would accept me or leave me alone. And that was always a failed experiment, because I'm just an animal. I'm like a scream looking for a mouth. And whiskey, milk, whatever it is, it's just going to be just alcohol in its purest form, whatever it is. And I shouldn't do narcotics because I do them alcoholically. Let's just get that out for the record too. So, but I'm alcoholic. I'm not and to anything. Done.
Please briefly describe your experience with steps 10 and 11.
So I think we kind of talked a little bit about that too. So in the beginning, I was very much an 86 and 87 guy because I had no world of meditation or prayer. I had none of that going on. It was only out of convenience and negotiation with this power that I was doing any kind of praying and talking. But I knew I had to learn. I knew it because I could see people like you guys doing it. And most of my early prayers were, God, just can you please take away all this manic anxiety and fear so I could just function in society? Could you please just turn my head off? And then I would start thinking about, well, could you please help me get a job? I mean, my idea was I'd come in here for 6 months, get a job, meet her, get a house, and I'd be fine. And I was crazier than I'd ever been in 6 months of my life sitting in rooms of AA. So, and 10 and 11 now are a little bit more like, I'm a lot more open than I used to be. Like I just got this book, The Greatest Thing in the World, which is love. I even got some papers from some of the old timers that I'll just try to sit quiet. And I just keep it that simple, just quiet time. Get into I was raised Catholic, so not too many thous and don'ts. I need less. Less is more for a guy like me. I just kind of keep it that simple. Done.
What does meditation mean to you, and how do you practice it?
So, if you have an active mind like I do, I need a lot of help, and I still presently do. So I'll give you an example. Like I was just in Half Moon Bay. So I grew up in the East Bay in Hayward, and there's a lot of influences of where I grew up, like from Oakland and all that stuff. I grew up on a lot of crazy stuff and bad deals. But Half Moon Bay was always special, and I went there this weekend, and it just looked at the sun. There's just something about anything that can slow me down. To me, that's kind of what I'm looking at here in this question around, meditation. I'll give you another story. My wife and I, we travel sometimes, and I was in France, and when I go to Portugal and Italy, I'm always called to those old medieval churches. I don't know what it is about them. And I'll just sit there quietly. And maybe it's because I don't understand the French too well, and if I go to those meetings, I don't know what they're talking about. But that's just kind of what I do. I just try to sit still. I even have a little Vespa that sometimes I'll just try to sit still, just try to be in the moment. So, done.
Please briefly describe step 12.
So that's the deal. That's, I heard a speaker once say that enthusiasm is God within, and you can't fake that. And I've come to see that there's people in here that are eating crackers and cheese, and I didn't come in for that crap, man. I want it all, baby. And for me, it's sponsorship. I've sponsored a guy at least once since I was 9 months sober. And my sobriety date is June 22nd of 95. It's gone up to 10, 15, book studies, and guys coming in and out, chips, all that stuff. Go to Duffy's out in Calstow. Oh, wonderful. Bitching at my wife because they're calling to, all that craziness. And I was just kind of thinking the other day is I just work with whoever God gives me. You know what I mean? I'm not here to count, because that'll be an ego trip, right? I don't want it to be about my ego. I'm just like Frank says, just one beggar showing the next beggar where the bread is, right? Just trying to do what was done with me. Done.
Can you share with us a spiritual experience you have had as the result of these steps?
So when I was in France, I was there because Portugal was in the Euro Cup, and it was a lifelong dream to go see that national team and call my dad. And we did. And I think sometimes God prepares us when tragedy's coming. And about 6 months before that man took his life, I was sitting at the Notre Dame Cathedral, which is one of the most famous churches in the world. It's there in Paris. And I kept getting called into it. And so much so that it freaked my wife out. And my wife is used to you guys, and she's used to weird, believe me. And what it was is I had somehow contracted an epidural abscess on my spine, and it compressed it, and I had gone paralyzed. And I think God was having me go in there so I could get a little fit. And the experience that I had was that even in our greatest, darkest sea, because the happy truck didn't come into my house in the middle of my sobriety, man. I didn't get my kid back. That's bullshit. That's not in the book. I didn't get a job I didn't have none of that stuff. I was a loser in AA, just going to meetings, sponsoring weirdos, And I realized actually that's what winners do. I just didn't know. But the spiritual experience was that I was fit enough to tell those priests or those doctors, hey man, you got a drunk here. You start pumping me up with morphine and other stuff, you better be really careful here. And I guess I'm still here. So that's that.
What is the message of AA, and why is it important to carry this message?
So I've heard someone say, there's a God and you're not it. Right? I think, though, in my own words, the message is, first and foremost, it's not necessary to drink. And if you have a problem with drinking, we can help. If you want to stop drinking, that's our business. If you don't want to stop, well, then that's your business. And I think the other thing of AA is that this is as I said earlier, this is a self-abandonment program. I'm sorry. It is not a self-help program. And it seems in the more in doing for other people that I discover me, which is the opposite of what I think it would be. I think the message also is that, yes, it's not doom and gloom. There is peace to be found in those dark moments. That book says joyousness, peace, happiness. That is what we're shooting for, but it's okay too if you're crazy, unhappy. And half of it, if you're crazy and unhappy, it's just because you just don't realize you're happy yet. That's the other thing, right? So, done.
What are some of the principles you are practicing in your affairs today?
So, I think honesty is kind of one that I fail miserably at with myself. If I'm not honest with me, how the heck am I going to be honest with you? But that's an important one. I think also kind of that anonymity thing we were talking about, where I got to stay right sized, is pretty important. I think love. I was just reading a little bit about love, how it's the first thing that a lot of us need to see when we get here to AA. I know it wasn't my case. I had done a good job of condemning the living hell out of me. And when you're sitting in a jail cell, or you're in an institution, you're being evaluated, it's hard not to be hard on yourself. So I think that's the thing. A lot of us, we go to places like Salvation Army, Skid Row, stuff like that. I think it just solves everything, it seems, that thing of just trying to help the next drunk. So I'm not too much of a principle guy. I just try to do what's indicated in front of me. Done.
Why is it important to put the welfare of others ahead of your own?
So when I put my welfare in front of everybody else, I ended up here. And arrested. I was trying to explain to those officers that they had it all wrong. But after a while, those guys, they see it all. They know, they can see a guy like me coming a mile away, I think, Let's see again.
Why is it important to put the welfare of others ahead of your own?
Well, and then the other thing is, this is an unselfish program. People say this is a selfish program. I'm sorry. That's not what our book says. In giving, I receive, right? So, and the other thing is, like I was saying earlier, if I'm not trying to help somebody else out, my default position is I'm going to start thinking. And if I start thinking, that's just a bad deal. It's just a bad deal. I'm going to eventually get sideways. So it is super important to try not to think about, our book says it, right? Maximum service to others, right? And that our thought life will be placed on a much higher plane when it's clear to these wrong motives. So, done.
How do you determine or gauge the quality of your sobriety in AA?
Oh man, that's a great question. So I think it goes back to like my wife thing, right? I've never been a good judge of anything, because like people talk about balance. I wouldn't know how in the hell to get balance in sobriety, because I've always tipped it to my favor. If there's 4 drinks, I'm thinking how I can get all 4, not hey, let's have balance and share. That's not me. But I think that in other people asking me to do things, thank you, that'll reveal if there's any quality. If people ask me to be a service, it's a privilege and an honor to be a service in AA. And I think if people are asking me to do that, I think what they're really seeing is this thing work in me, not me. And if there's any kind of quality, it's that, like the book says, that horrible past that a guy like me had might be able to help some suffering soul. I think if there's any quality in that, it ain't money and where money comes and goes, relationships. I used to have the same relationship. She just got sicker and had a different name every time, and they were always violent too. They were crazy, because crazy attracts crazy, and you're drinking in there, so that's not quality. So, but ask the guys I sponsor. Ask my sponsor, look where I sit. Look how I dress. That's what I was taught. Do my socks match? Do I have clean underwear today? That I keep it real simple, Do I have toothpaste? So done.
Why do you think alcoholics relapse?
So I think that a guy like me gets drunk long before I ever take a drink. I stopped doing the things that got me sober in the first place. I become somebody. Once again, I get an image. I got to protect that image. I get my rights back. Just exactly what do I have the right to, just because I was fortunate enough to stumble into a meeting of AA. I've never been able to reconcile that in my mind. And my ego, again, what happens is I'm down here, I feel like crap, and I start doing things. People start giving me a pat on the back, and I get up here, and it'll just cut me every time, and it just, like, I always head down. So And that's, again, why it's important to have a sponsor. My sponsor's not impressed. He's not impressed with anything. He's sober 40-something years. His sponsor's sober 800 years. You know, they don't care about that. So, yeah, I think that's, I think relapse is if we take these steps, it doesn't say we're going to stay sober. It says we have an experience, spiritual in nature. And I think most people, what happens is they never do that 12-step. They never do the 7th step. They never do that chapter that says working with others. And that's why, at least on my watch, that's why they go down. They get too filled with themselves. So, done.
Are you willing and able to sponsor other members currently?
Yes, all the time, 100%, since day one after I finished the steps. Done.
Presently, what is the most important activity in your recovery program?
Presently, so obviously working with others is very important. Having an active relationship with my sponsor is very important. I think the other thing is I have a little book study. It's not much of a book study. We have a little yoga place we get to go to, and we just have a bunch of knuckleheads over there. You know, everybody's talking, nobody's listening. Half the time we're lying to each other. You know, it's a good saying. You know, it's good. You know? I think that's kind of important. The meditation and quiet time is good. But, you know, the important activity, again, I keep going back to is I got to just stay honest with myself and small enough to stay in AA. I'm going to be speaking out in San Francisco. I got a call to go speak out in Michigan. Those things, that's not what AA is about, man. You know, I mean, I got a good job. That's not what AA is about. You know, I got a little, you know, that's not what that's about. The important activity is, like my sponsor said, to remain mindless in here. Just stay mindless and be willing to do whatever it takes. Done.
Would you please generally describe the purpose of the 12 traditions of AA?
So what do you do after you do these 12 steps? I was told we go to a meeting, not because I need a meeting, because maybe I could help somebody else out. That's where I met my sponsor, was in a meeting when I was dying in AA. Because I was one of those guys that 89 days sober, they were saying go to 90 meetings in 90 days. Well, my question is, what do you do on the 90th day? I wanted to drink, you know, and that's not in the book. So I try to go to meetings to try to be a service, to be a humble servant. But then there's these other things here to help us out with stuff like business meetings. And what I realized is, man, all kinds of that good stuff that you hear go right out the window in a business meeting. Maybe that doesn't happen here, right? So it's kind of important. And when I talk about the traditions, I go out of the long form. Those are a derivative. In fact, it's ironic because the short form of the second tradition is actually longer than the long form of the second tradition. So what are we doing here? What's going on, right? But the long form actually is what those came from. Bill knew he couldn't get 3 pages of content passed by all those groups. So he condensed it, got it approved at the First World Conference, and here we are. And I wouldn't disagree with that, but anytime I share with a guy, we go right out of the long form. For example, I'll just say this, is like the third tradition is very different in the short form. It has nothing to do with drinking. The long form says our membership ought to include those who suffer, and they use the term suffer. And I don't know about you, but I suffer from alcoholism. That's a hell of a big difference than a desire to stop. My dad has a desire to stop drinking if he got arrested on New Year's Eve because he had one to eat. That don't make him alcoholic. Done.
Can you give us some examples of meeting etiquette?
So like usually I'll try to put a collared shirt on or, you know, nice clothes, right? Sit in the front, be quiet. We're kind of talking about here, be respectful, eye contact. We clap a lot. I was kind of taught, you know, clap a lot. Thank the speaker. Get there early. Get there as early as you can. Try to stay a little later. You know, those basic things, the meeting before the meeting. You know, people say you should go to a meeting a day. I mean, our traditions, there's another one. In that same third form, it says, when 2 or more are gathered for sobriety, they may call themselves a group. That phone, I mean, I'll have sometimes 6-7 meetings a day from knuckleheads, you know, or weirdos and all that stuff. And so I think the etiquette is, you know, and donuts, right? In the old days, they had donuts, and they had the donuts because of that sugar in case you were fiending for a drink like I was in the beginning. You just give them a donut and, like, relax. And then there were jelly donuts because they thought that shit was funny, you know, they had shit all over their face, you know, and stuff. So I think the etiquette is just less is more and keep this thing simple. And Bob talked about it. Let's not louse this thing up with Freudian complexes and all that horse shit. You know, we're not intellects. We're nut jobs, you know. Done.
What role models do you have in sobriety?
So I don't agree with people that say there's no look, nobody's better or less than in here. And that was my problem. Is I was either better than or less than. I wasn't eyeball, but I'm sorry. There's people that I definitely respect the living heck out of in Alcoholics Anonymous. Guys like Gene Duffy, the old giants of Norm Alpe, Chuck Chamberlain. I'm more of a Dr. Bob guy versus Bill. Bill's story was first. Bob's was in the back, humble guy. Bob never got accused of infidelity, dropping acid, and all that other weird shit Bill was doing. Bob was just simple. Those are my role models. Guys aren't trying to pipe up, but guys are just kind of the giants behind the scenes, that you never know. So, yeah, I got a lot of role models, partner. A lot of them. And then there's those that teach me what not to do. And if I'm not careful, I might be one of those guys too. So, pass.
What advice do you have for newcomers in AA?
So I don't really have much advice because I'm just another drunk here. But what I like to do is I like to go in that book. And what that book says is that if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, you're probably alcoholic. And that you may be suffering from an experience that only... So I just try to keep it simple, that maybe what they need to do is just take these steps, because that's all we got here. And that's all a guy like me can do is just help them through the steps. And after that, help them get a guy to get the steps. If they need a ride, I'll go take them to get a ride to fill out a resume or go down to school, whatever. But I think, we're supposed to be treating alcoholism in here. So that's not advice, but that's the experience that book says. Pass.
What advice do you have for old timers in AA?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. And advice is capitalized, too.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, I don't know about advice, but what I've seen is that there's kind of two types of old timers. There's the bleeding deacon, and then there's the elder statesman, right? And I hope that I can become the latter. Done.
Last question. Can you please describe what this experience was like?
So, it went from, holy shit, what have I agreed to? So this is kind of cool. So when things finally settle down, this is a privilege and an honor. So I want to thank you very much. And I don't know where this is all going to go, who's going to hear it, but whoever hears this, I sincerely hope that you find what you're looking for here in AA. And there's a lot of people pulling for you, and we love you. So thank you.
Thank you, Victor, so much.
All right, thank you. Does that work?
That works great.
Cool.
I'll read our little closing statement here, which you're probably familiar with, and then we'll conclude the meeting. So this is from the old preamble. Wilmington Preamble of 1941, if you'd like to be specific. I wish to remind you that whatever is said at this meeting expresses our own individual opinion as of today and as of up to this moment. We do not speak for AA as a whole, and you are free to agree or disagree as you see fit. In fact, it is suggested that you pay no attention to anything which might not be reconciled with what is in the AA Big Book. If you don't have a Big Book, it's time you bought one. Read it, study it, live with it, loan it, scatter it, and then learn from it what it means to be an AA.